I was reading the Grand Chessboard by Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Brzezinski.
Yeah, to try to prepare myself for this
Yeah.
discussion. He's kind of a dubious figure, but
No, no, no. It's fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah.
he
He's a very
brought.
bright guy.
Yeah, he's very smart, and he put forward an interesting argument that Azerbaijan and the neighboring regions were sort of a cork, as he called it, on the bottle of the Central Asia, sort of preventing Russia from accessing Central Asia.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting in light of the recent treaty between Azerbaijan and Armenia to allow for the passage of an
Yeah.
oil pipeline in the Zangezur
Yeah.
corridor. And so I was just wondering if you'd like to
Oh, yeah.
elaborate on those
Well,
issues.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, I didn't like a lot of his policies, but I respect him because he was one of the last officials in the White House to read. At least he studied, and he had his own, of course, conclusions that we may agree or disagree with. But and he was a Cold War warrior in some ways, and being Polish originally added to his intense, anxiety about Soviet Union and Russia itself, which I share with him, by the way. But he understood something fundamentally, that Russia was way out of its own national boundaries, where the Russians lived, for a reason, because its political culture was always imperial. That is, I mean, one of the reasons for the collapse of Soviet Union and the emergence of a nationalist like Putin is because that dream was shattered with the collapse of Soviet Union, and Putin has promised to rebuild it, though he has fundamental problems, as you see in Ukraine, because that old imperial regime cannot reproduce itself in a world where computers and social media and a very different generation lives. Neither Ukrainians nor anybody else will take the Russian armies and obey. They will fight back, as you have seen their heroic fight. But I think Berzinski understands that the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the countries of Southern Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and the 5 republics of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. These are all beyond Russia's border, but they are viewed by the Russians as buffer between themselves and China, buffer between themselves and the British in India, originally at least, buffer between them and the Muslim Middle East, whether it's Iran or Turkey or the Arab Middle East. That is, it kind of creates a belt. And of course, the Baltic states protects it from Europe and a possible invasion again. Germany, NATO today, and so on and so forth. But this is the mentality. It's imperial, but it's incredibly insecure and anxious because it has been invaded by Napoleon, by Hitler, and so on and so forth. Russians, as Putin gave a lecture to President Obama, live in this permanent sense of insecurity about their future. And I think part of the reason we have such a hard time finding peace about Ukraine is that they see Ukraine as NATO moving into their border, European Union moving into their border, therefore they should be stopped.
Yeah, and that desire for borders is related to economics. I mean, you saw that at the end of World War II when Stalin wanted these buffer states in Eastern Europe. So not only so they couldn't be invaded again, well, why not have democratic countries? They can be buffers. Stalin's view was that the United States was so economically powerful that it would trade with them and therefore exert influence, and therefore they would not be dependable allies or buffers. So he left the Red Army in there to make sure they would be. And I think that Putin has some of that same some of that same attitude or belief. And again, the going back to Mehrdad's use of the term imperial, because I think it's very important. This was not like the Baltic states, which was taken by the Soviet Union. The Tsar took this. This was part of Imperial Russia.
Yeah.
And
I think so I have a very different view of like Bolshevik revolution. People are socialist revolution for justice. I think it was actually an attempt to save the Russian Empire under a new ideology. I think Lenin was as much of an imperialist as Stalin was, as the Tsars. But they saw that the internal conflicts, economic degradation, and so on and so forth, was such that this empire needed a new ideology as the glue, as a cement to keep it together. In fact, what really is interesting is what happened to the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany after the First World War should have happened to Russia at that time. And it did happen partially, but the Bolshevik Revolution re-linked it together. And it then happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union disintegrated. The Soviet Union's disintegration is actually what should have happened in 1917. But the communists, under the slogan "Proletariat of the World Unite," basically kept all these non-Russian entities, governments, or countries actually under Russian domination. But I have to come to this, what you mentioned, very important, this Zangezur area. I think it was a brilliant move, to be very blunt with you. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. You find Russia in a very weak position. Busy in Ukraine, overwhelmed in Ukraine, bleeding in Ukraine, embarrassed in Ukraine, however, really under pressure from United States and European allies, in the arms of China to somehow survive economically, selling its petroleum and gas to the Chinese. That's very embarrassing for a proud Russian imperial regime like Putin's. But the Caucasus was the backyard of Russia. At any point they wanted, they would send, look what they did to Georgia. President Saakashvili of Georgia, whom I have met, he tried to create an independent Georgian state, and what did they do? They just went and invaded it. And they almost partitioned Georgia by force. That's when Putin was not busy in Ukraine. Once he got busy in Ukraine, Azerbaijanis could breathe. They signed a new oil agreement with various oil companies, British Petroleum, US oil companies. And Armenians also began to sort of flex their muscles. But this historical animosity between the two, Armenia and Azerbaijan, had also given an excuse for Turkey to become involved. Turkey was arming and financing President Aliyev in Azerbaijan because Armenia is the old enemy of Turkey, and they wanted to somehow sandwich, basically ham sandwiched, as they call it, Armenia between Azerbaijan to the east and Turkey to the west. The only country which was, to some degree supporting Armenia, aside from Russia, was Iran, to the shock and surprise of everyone. But given Iran's problems itself, Armenia could not rely on it. So the essence of that problem was, as Stalin had always manufactured artificial problems, was that there is Armenia, there is Azerbaijan, two republics, former Soviet Union. There was an enclave, which was called Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno in Russian means mountainous Karabakh. 90-some% Armenian population. He carved this Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenian enclave, and gave it to Azerbaijan. Why would you do that? A psychiatrist would tell you that he was a Georgian, and because of that he hated Armenians, which the Georgians do. But aside from that, why was he doing? To create conflict between two neighboring states, so Russia can always send the Red Army, so we will bring peace You cannot fight over this. He created an artificial. So Soviet Union collapses. What does Armenia do? The first thing they do, they send their armies, they take over Nagorno-Karabakh. When Azerbaijan sent its army, it was defeated by the Armenians. So 14% of Azerbaijan was taken over by Armenia. That was an Armenian enclave. They claimed it, they took it, they seized it. Russia supported it at the time, free of any conflict. Iran also cheered a little bit. Azerbaijan was humiliated. Azerbaijan went into the arms of Turkey to rearm itself. And recently, they used Turkish arms and money to take away not all of the Nagorno-Karabakh, but a good part of it back. So this conflict is just going on completely over how Soviet Union basically created it back in times of Stalin. But meanwhile, something much more important, Azerbaijan is sitting on an ocean of oil, and it doesn't have common borders with Europe, but it wants to ship its oil from the region, from the Caucasus. So it builds a pipeline. The pipeline should go through Turkey to a port into European markets. So who will guarantee this though? And how would Azerbaijan link it up? Now, I know we are confusing people unless they look at the map. Azerbaijan actually is two Azerbaijans. Azerbaijan to the east, and then Armenia cuts it through. Look what's Stalin did. And then there is this autonomous region called Nakhchivan, or Nakhichvan, as the Armenians call it, Nakhchivan. Nakhchivan is part of Azerbaijan, but did not have common border with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan wanted to connect itself to Nakhchivan and via Nakhchivan to Turkey, so this pipeline can go through, basically. But Armenia blocked it. So there is that line Zangezur, right? Which is right north of the border with Iran and Armenia, right? So President Trump comes in, looks at this situation. You want to get rid of the Russians permanently. You want to also bring down Turkey's influence as much as you can, because Erdogan is such a megalomaniac. You also want to make sure that Azerbaijani oil reaches Western markets, and you want to make United States a major player. What do? You go to the two sides and say, "I'm going to guarantee peace between your two governments. At the same time, I'm going to provide security to the Zangezur area, and we're going to be there for 99 years or 100 years, and U.S. oil companies would help. Armenia is secure. Azerbaijan, you guarantee the territorial integrity of Armenia. Armenia, you guarantee that you will not go and seize more territory in that Nagorno-Karabakh enclave, and you will both benefit from shipment of oil. And of course, a little bit of money help to Armenia, which is struggling, is always helpful. You got a deal. And suddenly, United States is sitting, just imagine this, 4 kilometers from the Iranian border. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
On the most strategic area, which is Azerbaijan of Iran, because Iran also has an Azerbaijan. And Iran is now looking to the north. There's United States right on top of it, staring at it. And the two countries that used to be so close, Azerbaijan and Armenia, are now friends of the White House. And Iranians are panicking. The Iranian regime is panicking. Putin is furious. Erdogan, a bit happy, but not that happy. Because as long as United States was not there, he was the kingmaker. And now he isn't. And he cannot foment conflict against Armenia. So in some ways, in one shot, we neutralized Russia, Iran, and to some degree Turkey. Wow. That was brilliant. And it's just amazed that this is not analyzed as we have discussed it here.